Lots to discuss. We have MS Now senior Capitol Hill reporter Ali Vitale outside that briefing, and our senior national security reporter David Rhodes tracking all this from Washington. We're also joined by New York Times chief White House correspondent and MS Now contributor Peter Baker, and Kevin Barron, president of Elevation Global Strategies and former executive editor of Defense One. So, Ali, walk us through what to expect today. Are lawmakers planning to really hold the administration's feet to the fire?
I think it depends who you talk to, Anna, because just down the hallway through the Capitol where I am, they're going to be briefed in the SCIF area. This is going to be a classified briefing, similar to the ones that this same group of top administration officials briefed for the Gang of Eight and some other relevant committee chairmen and ranking members. So some of the people in this room will have heard what the administration has to say before. I think what's new about what lawmakers might press on today is, one, the sheer number of them who will be able to ask questions, but two, the fact that our team and the Wall Street Journal prior to us were able to report just yesterday that Rubio did comment to some of those original senators about what the plans were in regards to Greenland, the idea that Trump has left on the table using military force to coerce a nation that is an ally. But Rubio seemed to make the distinction that Trump wants to instead buy Greenland. I think that spurred more questions in a building that was already teeming with them. And I will say, asking senators on their way in, even Republicans who fully support what the Trump administration has done here, have said that they are going in with questions specifically around what is the plan for what comes next. And I think in my conversations with experts and sources alike, that is the biggest concern. And it doesn't really know a political party. Instead, it's just, we want to know that there's a plan here and what the U.S. endgame is.
Right now, the Republican Party holds the White House, holds the Senate, holds control over the House, and we have not seen them hold the administration to account. Peter, at this point, does anyone in the White House even pause to consider congressional pushback or authority? Has that ship set sailed?
No, I don't think they worry too much about that, honestly. I think you're right to point out that Republicans, of course, control both houses of Congress, which limits how much Congress might do. It obviously is up to Congress under the Constitution to declare war, but the administration is making the argument that it's not at war, and therefore Congress doesn't have to be involved other than giving notification. And the Democrats seem to be somewhat split themselves. Right? Ali knows this better than I do about exactly how far to take this. Nobody wants to be seen as a friend of Maduro. He was very unpopular, obviously one of the world's most repressive leaders, and many Venezuelan Americans are very happy today that he's gone. But they want to stress the issue of, uncontrolled power being asserted by President Trump to do what he wants. I mean, we saw this just the other day in that interview with Stephen Miller, very revealing in a way on CNN, in which he said that the world is governed by power. Therefore, in other words, the president can do what he wants, whether it be in Venezuela or Greenland, not a world governed by laws or standards. That's what the United States has at least ostensibly pushed for the last number of decades. Instead, very openly, you hear Trump's top advisor saying that he can do what he wants because he has the power to do so. And the question is whether Congress agrees with that. In effect, by their own admission, it looks like they're going to let him do that because they're not going to be able to muster majorities to take significant action that would stop him.
Yeah, we'll see, I guess. We did just see Senator Schumer, the minority leader there, head into this briefing room, and on his way in, he said, I hope we get answers today. Yesterday, President Trump did express some concern that if Republicans lose the midterms, he could be impeached. Peter, is there a sense that the White House is just racing against the clock right now, taking all their big swings right now?
Well, I mean, I don't know that I would expect that they would not do that after losing the midterms anyway. The truth is they haven't used Congress very much since taking over again. They've been doing most of what they want to do through executive power, or the assertions of executive power, some of which have been, brought up in court. But they've gotten a lot of it done that way. And other than their tax bill this year, Ali, again, knows better than I do, they basically have let Congress, stew in its own juices and ignore it. And I'm not sure they wouldn't continue to do that after midterm, even if the Democrats were to win one or both houses of Congress. That would obviously be more complicated. Congress would be more of a pain. As President Trump said, it's theoretically possible they could try to impeach him again, although there's no indication that the Senate would convict him on a third try. So it would be more of a political act than anything else, probably. But, the president right now is relying on his own assertion of authority, his own assertion of power. That's the way he's governing.
And we have seen, the president and members of his administration continue to really hammer home this message that they are in control right now of Venezuela, that the U.S. is in charge. David, what are we learning about what's happening inside Venezuela right now and the conditions on the ground?
So, our colleague David Noriega and Kay Guerrero have been hearing that essentially fear has returned to the streets of Caracas. There was brief joy, but they're called, they're motorcycle gangs, essentially, that act as enforcers for the Maduro regime. They're called colectivos, are out in Caracas looking for people who supported the U.S. Seizure of Maduro. And I just want to say, looking at this more broadly, what the Trump administration is trying to do in Venezuela, if we look at past wars, it's the equivalent of the United States capturing Saddam Hussein in Iraq and asking Baathists to sort of run the country and do whatever the U.S. says. It's the equivalent in Afghanistan of the U.S. capturing Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban, and then saying to all these other Taliban, you have to do what we say or we're going to capture you next. And I just think there's enormous questions about whether this strategy is going to work. It's unprecedented. And I think there's, real concerns that you're essentially dealing with a new regime on the ground with the same players, particularly Cabello, the interior minister. And the bottom line is just this is, heartbreaking and potentially, dangerous for average Venezuelans. They are not being helped so far. So we'll see how this plays out.
I mean, the reporting that there's widespread surveillance, that control of citizens in public places by police or military or paramilitary members, motorcycle gangs that have set up checkpoints to search people, search their phones for any kind of anti-government messaging, that there's an official state of emergency that's ordered security forces to also, have safety precautions, advising people that they need to leave if they are Americans because of the risk of torture and terrorism and kidnapping and crime. Kevin, does any of that sound like the U.S. is actually in charge right now? And what would it take for the U.S. to actually take control?
Well, of course it doesn't. But when you mentioned, that the regime was going to be looking at in cell phones for anti-government messaging, I mean, that's what the United States is doing under Trump for anyone who enters the United States. That's the same thing. Look, I think if you zoom out for a minute and what's going on in Venezuela and with Greenland and our NATO allies, take a pause and think. These are incredibly destabilizing actions. In the world of international security, it's often thought of or said that stability equals security. Well, this is the opposite of that. And David is right to point out that we have no idea how this ends. It's all eerily too familiar to the wars of the last 20 years that he was involved in and I covered. And we don't know what comes next. And I think the celebrations of Venezuelans initially at the removal of the dictator are quickly being muted by this chaos that comes. So between not knowing what comes next at our back door here with Venezuela and Trump openly threatening a NATO ally, causing Europe to now have a two-front crisis, handing this gift to Moscow, all equals nothing but instability for the moment. It's hard to predict what comes next.
Right, you're referencing the threats to try to take Greenland or acquire it in some way, whether it's by buying Greenland, which Rubio has suggested, or actual military force, which the White House hasn't ruled out. But before we pivot and talk more specifically about Greenland, Peter, just in the last hour or so, we learned the U.S. Has seized a couple more Venezuelan oil tankers, and this comes after the president posted last night, quote, I am pleased to announce that the interim authorities in Venezuela will be turning over between 30 and 50 million barrels of high-quality sanctioned oil to the United States of America. This oil will be sold at its market price, and he says that money will be controlled by me. Peter, this emphasis that it's all him. He is in charge in Venezuela. He controls the oil money. Are we supposed to take him at his word? Does the world take him seriously when he says these things?
Well, I think the world has learned to take Donald Trump seriously. I think for a long time, people kind of brushed off some of the more outrageous or extraordinary things that he would say, the provocative things he would say, well, it's just Trump being Trump. It's all bluster. This talk about Greenland in his first term, people kind of blew off and said, well, it's just Trump. But in fact, I think he's demonstrating that he means a lot of the things he says, and he's willing to do a lot of things that no other president would be willing to do. What he's talking about doing here is seizing another country's oil without explaining what possible legal rationale he has for that. Going in and getting Maduro is one thing. There's an argument about the legality of that, but there was an indictment against Maduro. He's been brought into a U.S. court. But the indictment against Maduro doesn't give the president of the United States the power to then take over another country and then take over another country's energy industry for the benefit of the United States. That's not been explained where the legality of this is. And I think that you're right. The rest of the world is watching this. They're taking their lessons from this. It used to be, we spent the last couple of decades trying to see if we could make Russia and China more like us. It looks more these days like the United States is becoming more like them.